I've already discussed in previous videos the director-driven strategies for shaping contemporary theater, in which directors assumed dominant responsibility for the content of the theatrical experience, and performers and authors became subordinate to the vision of a director who realized the potential of theatrical resources to engage audiences to a greater extent than the literary, language-oriented resources available to writers. And directors became the managers of the ensemble, the group that fashioned the theatrical experience. But the director cult has its limitations, and those lie within the directors who seek this kind of power over the theatrical experience. The vision of the director, the style of the director, the way the director interacts with performers in relation to goals established by the theater for which the director worked, can impose limitations on the capacity of theater to engage audiences. The director cult operates most comfortably, let us say, in the conventional theater apparatus, the institutionalized kind of theater. That is a building that's called a theater and employs all of these people who have their jobs in the theater, and these jobs are segmented according to their specialization. So the actors do acting, and the costume designer does costumes and does not do lighting, and the lighting designer does lights but doesn't handle sound design, and musicians do what they do to support a performance, and the director mobilizes these resources in relation to his or her vision of how best to utilize the resources. But those resources have to be made available within an infrastructure that recognizes them and organizes them accordingly. And that's the conventional theater that has its special place in society insofar as it's designated a space in a city for its performances, and it's allocated resources through the government or through people who have invested in the theater, like Broadway, where it's investors who put money into theater productions in theaters, in the theater district, and according to rules and laws governing the theater, the contracts with unions and clear definitions about who's doing what, and contracts for governing the space and so forth. But all of that organization also has its limitations as far as developing theatrical imagination. As we have seen, theatrical imagination does not depend on a specific space. It can happen anywhere. And by the 1980s, performers who wanted greater creative freedom in shaping theatrical experience understood that they needed to develop alternative ways of organizing the theatrical experience that didn't depend on this heavily institutionalized way of providing theater to audiences. So we have this performance group kind of culture emerging in the 1970s with different kinds of organizational structures to facilitate this presumed creativity that lay dormant within performers rather than authors or even directors. And I do want to mention Andy Warhol, who seems to have been an inspiring figure in this direction. He was a visual artist who got his start as an illustrator of advertisements, but then moved into a kind of radical, experimental kind of art in the 1960s, in which he incorporated images, icons from pop culture into these kind of high art manifestations, images, silk screens, photo paintings that appeared in high-end galleries, the soup cans and the images of Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley and so forth, that made him famous at that time. With the wealth that he amassed as a visual artist, he began a kind of experimental performance culture in Manhattan, where he had obtained a large space in Midtown Manhattan. It's kind of a loft warehouse environment that he transformed into his home studio and also performance space. And he staged these performances. He worked in film, made these unusual experimental films, an 8-hour movie about a person sleeping, an 8-hour movie of the Empire State Building, and then movies about the people he knew who showed up in the factory, as he called his loft, with its walls lined with aluminum foil, so it was very shiny and reflective surfaces everywhere. And a strange underground culture gathered at the factory for these parties and performances. And he organized people's lives or did things to get people to do things for cameras or for others in terms of the party culture and so forth. It was a very radical experiment, social manipulation that involved a powerful theatrical component, a lot of transvesticism, fashion, and dressing up in unusual various costumes, and then continuing the roles outside of the party and elsewhere throughout Manhattan and down in the Chelsea district and Greenwich Village and so forth. But Warhol looked upon life itself as a performance that one could shape and develop as an artistic project and open up some understanding or awareness of this kind of underculture or underground culture in the realm of art and urban life that theater simply could not accommodate. It probably couldn't even tolerate it. So Warhol opened up possibilities for performance in ways that people probably didn't realize when they themselves decided to develop these performer-driven performance groups. These kinds of groups, unlike those involved with the director cult, involved a collaborative kind of project making. It was very interdisciplinary, involving people from outside of the theater as well as in the theater, as Warhol had done, and often involved a lot of technology in the development of the performance, which was certainly the case with Warhol as well. We've sort of examined that approach to performance a little bit in the Jesserin play, Whitewater, but I do want to mention groups such as Mabou Mines in New York. It's a performer-driven company. People join Mabou Mines, and Lee Breuer was the sort of guiding architect for the establishment of the group, but he was not the artistic guru, so to speak. He didn't claim to become like a director figure, and although he did direct things or make things happen, but the idea is that performance emerges out of the performers and what the performers want to do, what message they have for audiences, how do they wish to engage audiences, and collaborate with performers to make the individual desires of performers interact, intersect, combine, merge with the desires of other performers to make the performance. And sometimes they would do plays written authors like Tennessee Williams or Sophocles, the famous production of Sophocles, Oedipus at Colonus, involved African American actors who performed the Oedipus at Colonus by Sophocles in a kind of gospel, the gospel at Colonus, gospel style. But it was a major transformation of the literary work, as you will see in the video clip that I've asked you to look at of Tennessee Williams' play. But in any case, Mabou Mines is this collective organization of performers who generate performance out of their interest as performers and what problems they want to solve as performers. That's the basis for engagement with the audience. Richard Foreman, also in New York City, established in the, well, it was the end of the 60s, and then in the 70s he built it up into a big thing. By the 1980s, he formed this ontological-hysterical theater, as he called it. It's very intellectual and a kind of a very arcane sort of theater. But he belongs more to the director cult insofar as was he had a collect people who worked with each other, and he relied on the performers to give ideas about what the performance should be, and created this kind of complicated, very intellectual theater that really challenges audiences as far as the content. It's full of obscure allusions. You have to be pretty well educated in a wide range of fields to appreciate all of the inflections, references, and details of the performance. But nevertheless, it was utterly unique insofar as a lot of nudity involved. He began experimenting very early with video and the interaction of video images of the performers and live performers. Had a lot of language, but it was never truly inscribed. Eventually, some of his works got published, but the works were never appreciated as for a literary identity independent of performance. They were sort of like the residue left of the performance, because the performance itself in the ontological-hysterical theater was about the ontology of being through performance. The ontology of being, I suppose that's a tautology, since ontology is about being. The ontology performance is ontology, something like that. As I say, it's a intellectual kind of theater. And Foreman himself said eventually that he wanted a theater that was independent of audiences, free of audiences. He says in one of his interviews, I think it's on YouTube, that he's sick of audiences and doesn't want to do any theater anymore, but the ontological hysterical theater was an effort to create a theater that existed independently of audiences or achieved some kind of experience of being, ontology, without confirmation from an audience. It was a theater that questioned the beingness of an audience insofar as the shows went on, whether there was an audience or not, or treated the audience as somehow a part of the performance in a way that the audience often did not recognize or could not grasp. With the living theater and Julian Beck, you always knew you started out as a spectator and sometimes wound up in the performance. So a line got crossed, dissolved a barrier that began in the performance. But in the ontological hysterical theater, it was almost as if the audience became incidental, accidental to performance, later on almost an inconvenience to the performance. And so in a way he sought to establish performance as something that transcended an audience. That's a really bold and extraordinary ambition on the part of a theater person. But a point I'd like to make about these performer-oriented kinds of theater is that this kind of theater is unique to the performers. It's not really reproduced by other performers. You take a play, Marie and Bruce, many people have done it, many theaters around the world. Students have done it, it's done professionally, it's been made into a movie. The text allows for this reproduction, this duplication or repetition of the same words, the same story by different performers. In a performer-driven culture, only the performers who make the performance really do it. It's not repeated or covered by other performers. It's unique unto the performance group. Just as the solo performers, people just don't do. Now, students sometimes will do a scene from Eric Bogosian and try and do it, but it just never goes anywhere. And once you've graduated from scenes in college acting class, you just never go back and do Eric Bogosian as Eric Bogosian did. The same as Spalding Gray and Sandra Bernhardt or any of the solo performers. It's all unique to the performer. And you could say, well, that has its limitations, but if you're interested in repetition of the same text by other performers, that's what writers do. Performers are really focused on the moment of performance that can't be reproduced, that is unique to that moment and driven by those who make that moment, the performers, not imaginary characters, not somebody who isn't there for the performance, either as a spectator or as an author. I've already mentioned in earlier videos Ariane Nishkin and Pina Bausch and Johan Kresnik, who have built up powerful performer collectives, but they work in state-run theater companies in Europe and depend entirely on the government to subsidize their productions. while some of the performance groups I've mentioned so far sometimes get grants from the federal government or state government, performance collectors of great interest that are connected sometimes to government subsidies, but not a part of the theater, conventional state theater apparatus, or the conventional theater as we understand it, even here in the United States. Teatro Royale de Luxe, I've asked you to read a web article on this fascinating theater group based in Nantes, France. They work with gigantic puppets, huge. They're as tall as skyscrapers, these enormous puppets. And they don't project kind of personal identity. It's hard to identify who's involved with this company. It's all very mysterious, almost as if they're anonymous. And they build these enormous puppets. They inhabit the puppets and make all the parts inside them move. And then they transport these huge puppets, their enormous studio in Nantes, to the sites of performance. These are always public. And they just come to a town and set up the huge performances, huge puppets, and make the puppets move through the town and create this stir, this huge upwelling of curiosity and interaction between people who have been brought together as a result of the movements of the giant puppets. One was the huge elephant that moved, and people on the elephant who are also puppets. And the one really famous one of this huge puppet girl, it's like a 10-year-old girl, but it's a huge puppet, and all these performers are inside the puppet moving all the parts of the girl's body. And the puppet company, the Teatro Royale de Luxe, is in residence in this community. And the performance has an effect on the community. It's not a story that's unfolding with these puppets. It's simply a huge appearance, a mysterious manifestation of some enormous magnification of human identity and diminishment of human identity insofar as the huge image of the little girl or the elephant and the people connected to the elephant, they're all very small in relation to this giant effigy. The puppets move in ways that are very expressive and kind of demanding, expecting something of those who are watching it. And some kind of strange transformation occurs in the community as more people become aware of each other in the community or change their relation to each other as a result of witnessing the appearance of the puppet. The performance has an impact on the community and changes it. Changes the way people do business, the way they walk in the town, where they eat, what they eat. This is all documented and recorded as an outcome of performance by the company. The company receives subsidies from the French government to sustain its performance because it does not charge anybody to see these performances. Absolutely free. And the purpose of the performance, as I say, is to create an impact on the social relations within the community that the company is visiting. And that's something that often just doesn't happen with conventional theater. It takes some grand gesture of theater invading a public space and establishing this giant presence within a community to achieve this extraordinary impact on the community and the emotional life of the community. So that's why I've asked you to look at the article on Théâtre Royale de Luxe, which includes a little video of the performance, and you can see other videos on YouTube. Very, very interesting and fascinating form of performer-driven theater experience. Butoh, Japanese form of theater, I've already mentioned it more than once, I think, in previous videos, certainly in relation to Kazuo Ono. But Butoh emerged after World War II in Japan. Kazuo Ono was a guiding figure of the Butoh aesthetic, and his students went on to establish these companies that sought to establish a uniquely Japanese form of theater that was also modern and not confused with the traditional forms of Japanese theater that the world public already acknowledged, the No theater, the Kabuki, the Bunraku, Bugaku, and wasn't distinctly Western. Although Butoh did apply techniques of German expressionism as a result of Butoh performers studying German dance in the 1930s and then bringing what they had learned to Japan in the 1940s, and then after the war finding a way to apply what they had learned to the development of a uniquely Japanese aesthetic. So Butoh became a very body-oriented kind of performance. It's very, very physical, and involved groups working to develop these non-linear forms of narrative. I've seen several Butoh performances, and I don't know what the story is about. There is no story. There is a sequence of actions that do seem to follow a logic, but it's really hard to articulate what that logic is. It seldom, if ever, employs language, but consists of very athletic, acrobatic kinds of performance, even in the performance of very simple gestures such as they had learned from Kazuo Ono. For example, Senkaijuko, they're perhaps the most famous worldwide Butoh performance group. Senkaijuko does a performance, or they did one, I'm not sure they're still doing it, in which a person goes up a rope, climbs up a rope, and then they're all male. It's an all-male group, Senkaijuko. All men, one by one, they climb up the rope, and then the ropes begin swinging, and Senkaijuko uses a lot of lighting technology to create extraordinary effects with light and shadow on the bodies that are moving. And a kind of extraordinary dance unfolds with these performers on the holding onto the ropes and swinging and interacting, coordinating with each other, sometimes synchronously, so that there's like 6 of the dancers moving together, swaying like a pendulum on the ropes, and then sometimes this kind of cross current of swinging pendulum, and then one rope will remain still while others are swinging, but the performer on this rope begins to turn over and then begin swinging this way as the others are swinging this way. So it gets very complicated, the choreography of the rope swings, and builds to extraordinary climbing. They don't always perform on a stage. There's one group in Japan that went into the mountains and they performed in a cave with all this water in it, and bats on the wall, and they did the lighting with torches, and very mysterious. But Butoh did want to move performance out of the theater. Sankai Juko does perform in theaters quite a bit, but they've also performed in streets. And I've asked you to look at a Butoh performance that's taking place in the street, so that they bring their athletic style of performance to spaces that are not traditionally understood as theatrical, and build extraordinary performance using ropes. In fact, some of their stunts can be dangerous. And a few years ago, one of the Butoh performers in New York, I believe with Sankai Juko, died from falling because they were trained to perform with ropes suspended high above the street, and he fell, lost his grip. But even on stage, some of these stunts they're really challenging and require a lot of coordination, but also they require a preparation that really cannot depend on a director to help them. That rope dance probably benefits from somebody looking at it who isn't in it. But the building of it, the making of it, the performance of it really relies on the performers interacting with each other. It just doesn't work unless the performers are coordinated with each other, and they can only get that coordination through each other rather than from some external person. That seems pretty clear from the way in which Butoh has succeeded with these different companies. I'm not sure how many Butoh operate in Japan, but the number has expanded, and now women are a part of some Butoh companies, and in Japan some women have established all-female Butoh groups. But Butoh emerged in the 70s as a kind of almost like a homo cult, and still retains a lot of that aura. But women became very interested in Butoh, and when they found they couldn't gain access to the Butoh companies, they set up their own Butoh kind of style, and many American performers, as well as performing in South America and in Europe, and also to some extent in Australia, have absorbed Butoh. It's one form of uniquely Japanese performance culture that Japan has been able to export successfully. No theater and kabuki theater, those happen only in Japan, and occasionally they visit the United States, and we treat them as exotic ideas of performance. But you don't learn how to be a kabuki artist here at San Jose State or anywhere else in the United States, except at maybe this or that university, Hawaii or Pomona, where maybe they have a class in it. But Butoh has more widespread absorption into mainstream Western kinds of theater or contemporary theater, because it is so rooted in modernity. But Butoh was also a way of life. They, in the Butoh communities in Japan, do not separate theater from life. That's why they in the street or not just confined to the theater. It's a way of living. They very much into this nudity and powdering the body, painting it white so it has this almost ghost-like quality to it, and living this very monkish, ascetic kind of existence, very, very disciplined and cult-like. But Butoh does all kinds of other extraordinary things. I saw one of their performances, this is Sankai Juko as well, in which a performer was crouched in one corner of the stage, way at the back, and he moved across the stage diagonally to the right to the edge of the stage before the audience. Took him about 20 minutes to make the move all the way across, and he was bringing with him, he was crouched, he never stood up, but was crouched and crawled and crept his way and made all of these, and he was carrying all of these things like a little house or a little town with him. He had all his utensils with him and this tools and a parasol. It was like he was such a struggle to get across the stage. This weird music, but it was gripping. It was amazing how this struggle to move from one place to another, carrying this heavy burden of all these things and never really standing up. You became so aware of this, every movement of the body. Meanwhile, there's this peacock on the stage. The peacock just comes out and it walks around. And there's food on the stage for the peacock. It's going down, nibbling on stuff, and just walking around like some kind of dazed creature, but it never goes anywhere. And the contrast between this dumb bird strutting about rather beautifully, but not going anywhere and just eating, and this slow march of the human being carrying all of this stuff to the other end, and then when he gets to the other end of the stage, unfolding and becoming this kind of, they just seem not even human anymore, just some kind of creature that had finally arrived, reached its destiny, and was not going to go anywhere else. And that this was really the most powerful sign of intelligence that you could find in the world.